Podcast, a podcast about the game of life and the hero's journey we all experience. Let's jump in with our host, Dylan Watkins, as he introduces today's guest.
Welcome, young adventurers, and on today's podcast, I have Noah Falstein. He is a game designer and producer who's been in video games since 1980s. He was one of the first 10 employees at Lucasfilm Games, as well as DreamWorks Interactive and 3DO company, which became defunct. He runs the Inspiracy and writes the Better by Design column for Game Developer Magazine and was hired by Google in April 2013 as the chief game designer, where he worked for the last 4 years and leaving in 2017. And we're going to find out what he's been up to lately. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Noah. Hey, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
Oh, that's awesome. So I think I saw you, I don't know when I connected with you, but I remember seeing you speak at a conference, and you seem so on par and so knowledgeable about the space and about, I think you're talking about neuroscience and gaming. And I was just like, okay, who is this guy? And so I started looked at him. I was like, man, I really like to talk to him. It looks like you've had quite a bit of experience in this whole area and genre. So I'd really like to first open up to you with it's kind of setting the frame is what got you into the whole world of games and game designs? What was the genesis that had you leave the community to go off to level up your skills as a game designer?
Yeah, happy to dive into that. I mean, I started so early that I often get people saying, "Hey, you're a game designer. Can you give my kids some advice about how to break into the industry?" And when I broke in, it wasn't an industry, and there was sort of no breakage involved. It was more a question of the people who kept saying, "Are you nuts? You actually want to try and make games for a living? I mean, what are these video game things anyway? You mean that Pong thing?" So it was that far back, and as a consequence, it was really just that I wanted to do it. I turned out to have a pretty good knack for programming, which was essential. I went to college in the late 70s and was the very first person in my college to work on a video game as part of my curriculum. And now they actually, I just saw last year, they were rated as one of the top 10 schools in the country to study game design. So I'm happy to see that it paid off on some level there.
What school was that again?
This was Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts. They basically let you design your own curriculum, and with all of my professors, they had never seen a video game beyond the very simplest arcade stuff. So it was really strange to have one of their students working on one, but that was enough to get me into my first job in the industry as soon as I graduated. And I believe people who said it might be a fad, because I didn't just want to give up on it. I figured I should enjoy it as long as I can before it burns out. And so far, so good.
That's awesome. Yeah, it feels almost like a cheat, like you hack the system when you're turning in your game as a thesis, and you're like, this is work. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I was supposedly showing off my skills in programming and what I'd learned about astronomy. I made a game about mining the asteroid belt. And in fact, if you've seen the recent Expanse TV series, very similar in concept to the kind of world that they were imagining of people out there mining asteroids and bringing the stuff back to the bases on the major asteroids and Mars.
And I would imagine people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are now looking at that video game, trying to understand how could we actually make this a real thing, since that seems to be the new
So Elon Musk, it's one of the bits of trivia a lot of people don't know. He actually interned at a company called LucasArts Games in the 90s, and I was working there as a consultant at the time. I probably was in the same room with him, but even my friend who was the project leader doesn't remember him as a particularly memorable intern. So, but I think it's great that it was Rocket Science Games. He clearly knew what he wanted to do, way back when.
He had a plan. That's really, really cool. I mean, what about you? I mean, you've had quite a journey from Lucasfilms to just Google. What allows you to make decisions to jump into one company or another company? What causes you to form that path? Was that luck, or was there a certain design structure or strategy behind that? I'd love to learn.
I wouldn't say a strategy so much as a lifelong passion for learning new things and wanting to try, experiment and be on the cutting edge of things. And the games industry has been wonderful for that, continues to be the place where so much is happening along those lines. And as we get into what I'm doing these days, it's more of the same of trying to find out what the new cool thing is, and how I can harness what I've learned before and move it into that next area. And that's really been what's happened. It's also a very turbulent industry, and I've been laid off. I've had companies fold that I worked for. But for each one that goes under, there are 5 new ones the next day that are starting up. So it's always exciting to be able to do that. And I've simply followed the fun and what interests me, and always had a little bit of thinking about, is this a smart decision in terms of something people will pay me for? But usually that comes second to, will this be a really fun, exciting thing to do? And happily, it's been an industry that's, been good at supporting people that way.
Yeah. And how's it been going through the journey? You said talk about following the fun. Game design is a really amorphous term that could be product design, it could be UX UI, it could be, there's a whole bunch of things of what would it be. How would you describe what is it specifically that you do in this world, or what are things that get you excited to do?
Yeah, game design. I started, as I mentioned, as a coder. Actually,
Yeah.
we all called it programming at that point. And the idea of design as a separate discipline. I was 2 years in the industry before I met the first person who actually was a full-time game designer. And it was a bit of a revelation for me. It was a guy named John Newcomer, who I'm still in touch with, and he had designed the arcade game Joust and some other famous ones. And I came to Williams Electronics and just was great working with him. He inspired me that I could actually expect to move away from programming and just do game design, which was always my favorite part of the process. And in those days, it was just a generic term. These days, there are at least 4 or 5 different disciplines within game design, whether you're a level designer or a systems designer or a narrative designer. But quite a few people, including me with my background starting that way, do at least a little bit of all of those things and more. Some of it is just figuring out what the game is going to be about. Some of it is getting into the sort of deep structure and doing spreadsheets and figuring out how each unit, each character in the game is going to have certain powers and how they balance against each other. Some of it is helping craft a story or structure a story or write the story yourself. And some games, of course, have no story, so it really depends on the type of game. And it's been a good mix. It's a rare discipline that, like architects and maybe a few other people, combine a mix of science and creativity and aesthetics, so that it's not enough to have a really good aesthetic sense like some fine artists might have. You really need to know the technology. Filmmakers, directors are also another group that have to understand how filmmaking works, how a camera, they have to understand optics, as well as good storytelling and all of that sort of thing. And being a game designer, I think, is very much like that.
That's great. Yeah, it's. I mean, you're designing. It's just, what can you design? You can design the levels. You can do level mechanics. You can do the power balance. You can do the narrative. And so it's like there's so many pieces that go into this world creation. Just find a slice, or you get a one-man army who just codes it and programs it. So there's a lot there, which I think is fantastic. 2 questions, but first question is, in terms of, do you have frameworks or models or go-to behavior things in terms of design that you lean on, like looking at, for example, the hero's journey arch, or looking at keeping it simple, or looking at play patterns or play testing? Or is there certain go-to things that you use to kind of create frameworks around your design process?
Oh, yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question. It's something I think about a lot. In fact, about 20 years ago, my colleague Hal Barwood and I did something called the 400 Project that was inspired by Hal, who was a former filmmaker. And he said, in film school, we have all these rules of thumb that they tell you about. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. If you have a camera angle looking down, that means one thing. If you're looking up, at the camera's looking up, it means another. He says, and by the year 2000, he said the games industry has enough information that we should be laying out what some of these rules are. So he and I went out and started basically collecting them from a lot of fellow game designers and writing up some of our own. And it never got fully finished. It's still a side project for me to do, I hope someday. But I think about that a lot. And in addition to those kind of basic rules, just to speak directly to what you're saying, one of the first things I tell people when I teach a class in game design is the first step that I always use is to identify your constraints. Specifically, things like major constraint is always budget. Is this something that you're going to be doing on the weekends on your own that basically has no money? Have you raised some cash? Do you have some savings? Are you working in a big company? And the biggest games now have budgets above $100 million, and it's quite a range from people sort of still working in their basements and going all the way up to these things that are actually completely on a par with big Hollywood blockbuster films in terms of budget and time. So sometimes the constraints are more technical of, you want to make a virtual reality game, or you have a genre constraint in that you love Fortnite and you want to make a game that's like Fortnite, but you're constrained because you're doing it on your own, and how can I get as close to that experience as possible? Anyway, knowing what those constraints are, it's one of the ways to tell the difference between a beginner and a real expert, because the beginners say, I want complete freedom, I don't want any constraints. And the experts actually welcome the constraints, because that's where the creativity comes from. When you're stuck in a little narrow space, that's when your brain, your subconscious kicks in and says, here's something that will actually work to make Fortnite on a budget of $100,000 instead of $100 million, that sort of thing.
That's great. I mean, because you want to know, okay, if I'm going to play the game, what box am I in? And so you're trying to define the box that you're in. But some people go, this is the greatest game ever. There's no rules, there's no constraints, there's no time, there's no nothing. But that doesn't sound like a game.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's great. Oh, that's a really good premise. I haven't thought about it before like that. So that makes a lot of sense. How do you, as you're going through them, because you've been in the games industry for a while, a little bit of time. How do you keep the magic alive? How do you keep getting, because sometimes it's a craft, it's something you're passionate about, but over time you lose some of the magic. Has there been things that have relit the fire in your soul to pursue this?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to say, it continues to do that. But the caveat is that, I'm constantly reinventing what I do. The kind of work I do now is just radically different than what I did at the beginning of my career. Even taking aside the difference between doing the coding and doing game design, the kind of game design I did, the very first projects, we had games that fit into 2K bytes, 2048 bytes of memory. And that was the entire code for the game, the images, any kind of sounds, and which by anybody who knows what's going on now sounds totally ridiculous. Sounds like saying, well, we had a full novel, but we fit it into the first paragraph, and it was, Warren, but that was all, it was one paragraph. But the thing is, that was what games, were limited to in those days. As that's changed, as I said, the specialties have come out, and it's meant that I'm constantly evolving. A lot of the work that I've been doing recently has been in games for health and games that involving neuroscience, as you mentioned. I've been working with virtual and augmented reality a lot. That the years I spent at Google were very good for me that way, because it overlapped very well with the time that they were experimenting with both their VR and AR projects. And I got to wear Google Glass for a year and experiment with what that was like, wearing that in public, something not a lot of people had a chance to do. So there's always new things coming out, sparking it all. And just this week, I'm talking to a new company, and they're doing really exciting work with major movie and television intellectual property to create games that will publicize those. And back from my earliest days with Lucasfilm and DreamWorks, I really have a penchant for combining filmmaking and storytelling with games and interactivity. So that's got me reignited something I haven't done in many years.
That's awesome. There's a lot to touch on there, and I have about 6 questions from that. Just one thing at a time. So first, we'll go to the Google gaming. Was Google because you're I think it was like chief game designer or lead game designer for Google, and was it primarily so for the AR VR? Did they come out with specific games, or there? Because I'm trying to think of what Google games there were. But was it primarily for the? Well, I just in full honesty, just trying to understand. Like I know they had the headsets like the Daydream. The Google Daydream, and definitely built on the cardboard before. Was that primarily what it's for, or what? Do you know what? Is there certain games that Google came out with?
Well, it's a story that I couldn't tell for a while because I didn't even know the full details. But and Google has taught me to be very careful about my non-disclosures. So let me just say all the publicly accessible information that. I was brought in 2013, and my boss and I were old friends, and he told me about this opening, and I went through the Google hiring procedure, which was pretty rigorous. And the idea was that his boss wanted him to create a 200-person game development studio within Android and make high-end, very high-quality games for the Android phones and give away the source code for free, because that's the way that Google does things, and lets other people make even better games and help compete more with the iOS game side of things, which was very successful at that time. But my boss's boss was a guy named Andy Rubin, who shortly after we joined the company, suddenly he wasn't in charge of Android anymore, and then he left the company. And it was only about a year ago that we found out that he'd actually been accused of sexual harassment and pushed out of the company. And it was that he seemed to want to follow up on the projects that he was espousing, including our 200-person studio. And we got up to about 20 people before we realized this was not going to take off. But that group then ended up doing many different things within the company. And I did work with a group that made a number of games for both Daydream, and we even did some little bit of work with the Tango augmented reality group. But they were demo projects, very simple games that were put out over the course of just 6 months or so. And unfortunately, they didn't get much publicity, so I'm not surprised you didn't hear about it. But the fun thing was that there were hundreds, or if not thousands, of people at Google who came from the games industry. And there were many, many different divisions within the company that were experimenting in games. There's something you may be familiar with is the Google Doodles that you get on the front page of Google when you do the search, and you get to click on it. And every once in a while, there's an interactive one, and a lot of them are games. And I worked with that group for a while. But as chief game designer, it was a great title. It was meant to be for this studio, but I ended up getting to morph that into working on game-related projects throughout the company. And great education for me. I just am sorry that things didn't work out, that we were able to get that studio going.
I mean, there's so many moving parts at Google. I actually remember driving, I have photos up somewhere on Facebook, I'm sure it can be searchable, of driving down to Google or up to Google and actually pitching one of our Sweet Escape games for the Daydream, and then trying it out and going, oh, that's great, make a bid and all that fun stuff. So, and I remember going to one spot that was wrong, and they're like, oh no, you got to take a car and drive 5 minutes that way to the other part. I was like, how big is this freaking place? I was like, I got to drive my car and I might be late to this meeting because I was like, oh my God. So I could see how you might lose a 200-person studio in a giant city of people trying to do stuff. So
oh yeah, I mean 200 was pretty good size, at least as an intention for Google, but it was still just a drop in the bucket worldwide. I mean, it was an amazing company to work for. I've never worked for anybody a fraction that large. And I also got, with the work I did, to travel around to, I think by the end I had hit 18 or 20 of their offices worldwide. And it's always fun to be able to go to some foreign country and walk into an office, and everything was always set up, my phone and computer all automatically connected to the internet. It really felt like walking into the future. And in fact, in this world we live in today, where everybody's communicating online over these video conferences, Google's been doing that for 15 years, and they have all of their studios linked together with these massive screens and great cameras in every one of the offices. So it was just a very surreal science fiction kind of experience.
Yeah, that moment where you pause, you look around, and you're like, "What am I doing here?" That's epic. So, getting out of that, you said you're much more focused on taking the skill sets and reapplying it and reinventing yourself and finding new ways to find excitement. And so, the areas that you're looking at right now is gaming, neuroscience, virtual reality, augmented reality, and how all those things work together. What about that are you passionate about? What are some things, what is your overall lay of the land and thoughts, how gamings relate to neuroscience and neuroscience relates to AR and VR and all that?
Yeah, wow, let me unpack that one, take it bit by bit. It kind of goes back to your earlier question of what I'm passionate about. And game designers, it's almost a tribal thing, that I find that people who are professional game designers, video game designers, I should say, although most of this applies to board game designers, we all have, 90% of us have extremely similar personalities. In fact, informally, we cluster on a couple of the Myers-Briggs personality test things. I think I found that in groups of game designers, about 75% of us fit into the same two categories that are only about 3% of the general population. So for example, we're almost all equally balanced between introvert and extrovert, because we need to be able to go off into a room and visualize a game in your head and figure out how all the pieces are going to work. And then you need to leave that room and work with a team. Maybe some of the early guys who could do everything on their own didn't have to do that, and some indie programmers, game developers now can do that. But even indies tend to need at least a couple of people to do the visuals or the sound if they are doing everything else. There are just too many specialist areas you need. So personality-wise, I think there's a game designer type. And what has really motivated me all along, I played all sorts of board games and created my own little games when I was a kid and a teenager. And when computers and video games came along, it felt like this was made for me. And I have so many friends in the industry who felt exactly the same way. So at its core, that creation of the interactivity, creating an experience that you author, but other people then get to build their own story, their own voyage as they play your game. That's what's kind of kept me going. And it's also what got me into this current neuroscience thing, because again, one of the things that we share as game designers is we want to know, we're getting inside the heads of our players. We're also observing our own neuroscience in action as we are responding to the games we make and trying to analyze what's fun, what isn't fun, what's working, when am I feeling overloaded and not able to handle all the inputs, when is it too boring and just not enough going on. And because of that, I've always been interested in how the brain works from a sort of informed, nerdy science kid background. And it was wonderful gradually over pretty much the last 20 years to run across more and more neuroscientists who turned out that there was this match made in heaven, because we game designers want to know how does the brain work? Why are some types of games so specific? Why do people get motion sick from virtual reality in the same way they can get seasick or car sick? And the neuroscientists, on their hand, they have all sorts of tests that they do for people. And the tests, particularly 20 years ago, would be, okay, here's a crosshair on the screen, and now a dot comes up. How quickly can you move the crosshair to that dot? Great. All right, now repeat this for 20 minutes and stay focused, and we want to measure all of this. And they put on, the EEG headset. And after about 30 seconds of chasing a dot around the screen, people are saying, am I done yet? Can I do something else? And so game designers and game developers create these wonderful things that are perfect test beds for what the neuroscientists need to do. And in turn, we're learning from the neuroscientists how to make our games better, how to make them more effective, and also how to help people, treat diseases and disorders through gameplay, or train doctors through gameplay. So it's all become this virtuous cycle where the game people want to know more about how the brain works. The neuroscientists want to use games more effectively to do their work. And, we're just in those early stages, really, even though it's been 20 years since I did the first one of these, we're just now hitting our stride and having big pharma companies fund this to the tune of, tens of millions of dollars on some of these projects.
That's epic. So it's basically, it's the perfect ecosystem for studying humans. So you're kind of like 2.0 Jane Goodall studying the monkeys, but we are the monkeys and we also made the forest. And that's what allows us to be able to actually say, okay, well, what would happen if I take a whole bunch of bananas, put them in a box and have a bunch of monkeys around them? They get all aggro and they smash the box. Okay, can we design a better forest or place? So I totally get what you're saying. It's an ecosystem, which is cool. And you're right, that allows us to study and pay attention and then get other industry experts to really study this and understand the value of it. And especially with VR, you can take over the entire space and environment. What do you think in the next 5 years is going to have some of the biggest impacts on neuroscience and this immersive technology? What are the areas do you think are really going to be either most impacted or the greatest opportunity to go and explore for people to really help us understand ourselves?
Boy, another interesting question. And I have an interesting monkey anecdote to pass
Please.
on. But let me hold that for a moment and answer your question first. Lots of times I've been asked, things like, what's the future of games or what's the next big thing? And what I've learned is, number one, it's really hard to predict the future. As everybody who saw VR, as I did back in the 80s and, believed it was really cool, but thought, yeah, by the year 2000, we'll all be wearing these headsets or having it beam, directly onto our retinas. And, some stuff takes a lot longer. Some stuff just never actually turns into what you think it will be. And one of the things that's always true is that there's not one future, but many futures. So in terms of this neuroscience and VR and AR and everything, lots of really exciting things going out. I'll mention 2 or 3 just off the bat. One of them is wearable headsets. I don't know the details. Apple is rumored to be working on their own augmented reality headset. And of course, they've got a great reputation for figuring out how to make cool stuff that consumers want and are happy to wear. My experience with Google Glass all those years ago was that, wow, having a headset is really useful and it felt like being super powered in a lot of ways, but making one that looks kind of menacing and makes you look like a Bond villain, probably not a good way to go. So, that was one interesting thing. But if we have a future where we can wear something that looks not much different than sunglasses and has both displays and cameras and all sorts of other stuff built into it, possibly has other wearable sensors so that you might actually be using some of your own brain waves to control what's going on. All of those things I think we're going to see in the near future. On the medical side, because we're wearing more and more sensors and you've got Fitbits and Apple Watches and these things that are monitoring your blood oxygen and your heart rate and all this sort of thing. I think we're going to see a lot more both on the fitness side and on the health side. So fitness meaning just exercise and calorie intake, and health in that And my wife actually was diagnosed with AFib, a heart condition, and we got her one of the new Apple Watches because it allows you to just hit the watch and essentially take your do an electrocardiogram and measure your heart rate and record that. And it's wonderful that devices are being able to do that sort of thing. Huge range of new areas that they're going into. The wearable stuff in general, whether it's on your head, on your wrist, on other parts of your body, I'm seeing all sorts of interesting things going on there. And one other thing that I'm really excited about that again crosses over in these different areas is eye tracking. There have been eye tracking headsets for at least 5 years that I'm aware of, but so far it's not mainstream. And most of the headsets you use for VR don't do eye tracking, but the ones that do allow you to control what you're doing just by looking at something. And boy, that feels like magic when you're doing it. When you combine that with augmented reality and you can look at stuff in the real world. I'm terrible with both names and faces, so I have lots of trouble remembering where I've met people. And I can't wait for the device that will let me walk into a busy conference area and have little pop-ups over the head of every person saying what their name is. And, this is Dylan, you met him at the Game Developers Conference, 4 years ago. The notes you took are, look here to scroll up on the notes. We really have the technology to do that today. It's just a little expensive. And obviously there are privacy issues around that. But if everybody buys into it, and I'm sure at conferences, the majority of people will be happy to do that. It's like having your business card out there, on your chest. It's going to be just great. So all of those things and many more. I mean, esports, just huge number of areas that are just burgeoning that are going to keep getting bigger and bigger for the next 10 years.
That's epic. Yeah. It's like there's as a confluence of all these different technologies coming together, very much how video games was a confluence of writing and, art and all these other things. And man, that 2K texture thing you're telling me, I was literally looking at my artist today and he was showing me how I was fitting everything on a texture. He's like, this is the 2K texture. And he's like, I'm fitting all the weapons on this one thing. I was like, oh, that's really cool. And he was showing me that like 2 hours ago. And come tell me you're like, I put an entire video game on that texture. I was like, I'm trying to understand that. I don't want to, like, that hurts my head to try to think about. I already think the constraints on like the Quest headsets are already hard. I can't imagine, and even though it's a 10-pound trash bag, try to shove 15 pounds of crap in it. And that's just the infinite game that we're playing. But what I thought was really cool is that you're talking about the combination, the confluence of biofeedback devices meets gaming, meets immersive technologies, and then bringing all these different interdisciplinary skills together to really create something that is greater than the sum of the parts. Like, for example, you had a great use case. I'm terrible at knowing names. If only this thing would tell me everything that I needed to know about this person so I didn't feel like a bad human, right? That's a bad social person, right? Which is a great use case. Are there other use cases that you see combining together these future of sensors and tracking things that actually solve problems? Because sometimes we get into the, there's like the, oh my God, this is so cool. And then you go, oh, what do I do with it? Is this a gimmick or is this actually solving a problem? So in what ways does it actually, are you excited about these future use cases to solve problems?
Well, I'll actually go a little farther and talk about anytime we have a new useful technology, it tends to both solve problems and create problems. You get cars and they're incredibly useful, but now you have car accidents and drunk drivers. We get cell phones and it was sort of almost overnight that smartphones made it mandatory to have one around, but you have problems with people not talking to each other or, being so immersed in their phones that they walk into traffic and cause a traffic accident. One of the things that I thought about when, talking about headsets and being able to see people, something that's come up for years now. I think there was some experiment being done at MIT 15 years ago of wearing something that had a camera that basically recorded your life. And same kind of deal, I'm thinking about memory stuff that, wow, wouldn't it be cool to just constantly record it And then if you need to go back and say, what was I doing, 4 years ago, or what was happening, that would be really great. Well, I watched the TV series Black Mirror, it's made in the UK, and they had an episode. They're really good at this, at taking what seemed like cool ideas and ferreting out the scary, awful parts of it. And they showed, and it's a spoiler for people who haven't seen this episode, my apologies, but they had a couple that get into an argument, and it starts out very small, but they keep throwing up on a TV. You basically tap this thing they're wearing and it throws it up on the TV. And he says, oh, I told you about her, she was an old friend. And she says, no, you didn't say she was an old friend. Sure, I did. And she goes and taps it up, and there he is 4 years ago saying, oh yeah, she was a lover of mine. Say, aha. And say, but you told me that it was okay. And no, I never said that. And their marriage falls apart because they are able to do that. And I had a girlfriend years ago who had an incredible memory, and I could actually experience that. She would say, did you remember to bring that thing back, from work today? And I said, what thing? You didn't say that. She says, oh, yesterday I said this and you said that. And she actually repeats it almost word for word. And I can even hear my voice when she does that. It's like, oh, you're right. I'm sorry I screwed up. So some things, the technology is going to be incredible in some ways, but it's going to be, social issues that we're going to have to deal with.
That sounds like a guy's worst nightmare. It's so funny. You're right. The Black Mirror is almost like the Game of Thrones, or it's almost like having a ex-girlfriend. We're like, oh, I'm gonna get with her, and it's gonna be different. It's gonna be better this time. And then you actually find the technology, and it's horrendous. It's crazy, because the technology is really a race between disaster and utopia. And then they just take this whole thing where they go on the utopia, and then they just hard turn it, which is terrifying. And it would be super beneficial if we all walked around with cameras. If I just walked around with a camera on my neck the whole time, it would be so useful. But let me ask you, what is a part of the human condition that having a genuine conversation like me and you going back and forth just like this right now has a certain level of it's cool, but then there's the privacy that we really want to have? There's like this weird thing, in order to be fully free, we don't want to be seen. And then so what about that? Why is that with us? Can you have any thoughts on a design human perspective of why we don't like being recorded?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex thing. I think, so I'm really big on evolution and looking at what's known about evolution or what's theorized to help figure out everything from game design to product design, that sort of thing. And what you bring up is one of those areas that is under research. There's a huge amount that needs to be done, and a lot of it is because there's no good way to research, for example, what human beings were doing 20,000 years ago, even 1,000 years ago. We've got some written records, but we as humans are really good at being deceptive or rewriting history to fit our view of it. And it's not even just a human thing. There is a lot of research with the great apes, our chimpanzee and gorilla cousins, to show that they also have learned deceptiveness, and they know how to hide things from each other, but they're also very social. And looking at that as clues to where our ancestors, our common ancestors lie. I think that as humans, we're constantly mixed between wanting to know lots of stuff about each other. It helps you survive. It's really critical that our ancestors that didn't really care what their fellow humans were doing were less likely to survive to become our ancestors, and therefore we all have genes wanting to know what other people are doing. But by the same token, people have learned that if they're completely transparent, there are unscrupulous other people who will take advantage of that and manipulate us. And so everyone learns as they grow up that there's some fine line in who they can trust. And if you think about a lot of our movies and books and games, for that matter, a lot of it comes down to who's trustworthy. And you can't count the number of plots that involve somebody who seems like a friend but turns out that they're actually a bad guy, or relationships that work out really well but then they go sour and suddenly everybody's at each other's throats. That's the human condition. And so on that level, I think these technologies will always be used in a combination. I mean, you say we're talking here, but I'm staring into a little green light on my laptop, and I'm not even sure where in the world you are, frankly, at this point. And it's gone a long way from sitting right in front of somebody, but we learn to accept those things. And I think that these new technologies, as with all technologies, will open up new things. You were very eloquent there of, sort of in between a utopia and a disaster. That's always happening. But also, if you look at human history over the last few thousand years, we've had a really good run in terms of most things getting better and better. Despite all the problems we have in the world now, there's a great book called Enlightenment Now that talks about all the trends over the centuries and shows how, in so many ways, things have gotten better and better. But of course, we focus on what the problem is right now. When I was talking to you earlier, I had a headset on and I'm having problems with my Bluetooth headset, and that's really irritating to me. But when I was a kid, it would have been a magic toy that was just blowing my mind, that it could actually connect without wires and do all these great things. So you get something new, and there's good stuff, and there's the irritations when it doesn't work exactly as you want it to.
Yeah. We quickly climatize to new stuff and then depreciate it quickly. It's the hedonic treadmill. So we're on it, we're running, and we're like, oh, I got to get faster. And so that, the importance of taking that step back, I could totally see. That does answer a lot of questions. Also, we are fascinating with like human drama. So like we're all pretty kosher, but if you're like in a Starbucks and all of a sudden someone starts yelling, everybody will turn and pay attention and go, what? Like, we're all pretty kosher beings,
Yeah.
And then you see that thing go down, and everyone, you pay attention because you want to know. It's a part of your world. And so it's built into our system, and we're wired for survival. So we pay attention to see, is that fellow monkey going to help me or hit me with a large rock?
Yeah.
And so that makes a lot of sense. And then if it's recorded, then you don't know what monkey's going to see that and hit you with a large rock.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've seen the recording thing happen, certainly Nixon, should have realized that recording what he was talking about was not a good thing. And, it goes way back before our current technology, that as soon as people were able to record things, there were scandals. I've read about when the telephone was a new invention and how a lot of people felt that it was breaking privacy and it was causing antisocial behavior because you don't meet somebody in person, you talk over this gadget. And, this is the nature of things. Or even people complaining about the invention of writing and how it means that people will no longer be able to recite 3,000-line epic poems. And he was right. I forget who it was who was saying that. It was maybe Socrates or somebody talking about the burgeoning, youth who just don't even memorize all these things. And now same thing's been said of Google or Wikipedia, that now instead of knowing something, you just look it up, and people are ignorant. Well, we're also you have at our fingertips more knowledge than anybody's ever had in history, even just 20 years ago. And there's a lot of good things about that, even if we don't memorize as much information.
Yeah, we're constantly cognitively outsourcing the stuff we don't want to deal with. Right? You're like, you know what? I don't want to worry about maps. Something else do it for me. I don't want to pick up groceries. Something else do it for me. I don't want to wear, like, in this day and age, like I can order in this conversation, I could order something, probably have it delivered, by the end of the day. And it's just amazing to think how fortunate and how blessed we are, but how quickly we adapt to that. Yeah. Do you think, let's just look at virtual reality. Do you think that technology is disconnecting us and making us more isolated, or is it reconnecting us? And if it is making us more, what would it take for it to actually allow us to become more reconnected, or is it already doing it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, as with any of these things, I think it does both. Although sometimes you want to be disconnected. That I know some people who use their VR headset to watch TV, and the quality of the TV isn't as good, but they can do it in a room with lots of distractions and people that they don't want to talk to at that time. And by having that, taking them completely out of the world, it's a good thing. But I absolutely believe that VR and certainly AR, when you can actually see the world around you as well, have huge potential to improve connections rather than discourage them. Boy, I could go on for a long time about that, but just the simplest example I'll give is I've been doing some work with a startup called Adventure Lab that their first product was a multiplayer virtual reality escape room where up to at first 4 people, and they've expanded it, can all enter virtual reality and become, it's Dr. Crumb's School for Disobedient Pets is the name of their first adventure escape room. And it's started by a couple ex-Pixar people, so it's got a very strong Pixar vibe. And there is a 5th person who is a host, who's a trained improv actor, who plays not only Dr. Crumb, who's the sort of comical bad guy, but also a guy named Chief, who's your commander who sends you off to infiltrate Dr. Crumb. And you and the other characters are all pets. You're a dog or a cat or a hamster, and you're an animated hamster in VR. It is, and people can play from anywhere in the world. It is amazing how VR can bring you together, and seeing somebody's hand gestures and head tilts, even as a giant, hamster, I can recognize my friend right away. And getting to be with them and getting to be with the other people on the development team and working in VR, it was a new level for me of feeling like I was in the room with these people, even though they were in some cases on a different continent. VR, getting into the neuroscience, can go straight to your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that does the fight or flight stuff, but it's also the part of your brain that helps you feel connected to people, triggers compassion and empathy. And VR is being used, one of the early uses I heard 4 or 5 years ago was taking people through some of the resettlement camps from Syrian refugees and bringing that to the UN, and having people at the UN get to have a VR camera's eye view of these settlement camps. And it, I've seen this particular VR experience, and it's amazingly empathic. You really feel a lot of what it's like to be there in a way that even a good movie can't do, because you don't have that sense of being there and being immersed in the actual environment that VR can give you.
That's really cool. The Adventure Lab, Dr. Crumbs, that I've downloaded it. I haven't played it yet. I've watched some playthroughs online. I want to go and play it. The one thing, human improv, a talented human improv. When people go, "Oh, I want to code an AI system to be able to do that for me," it's like, clearly you don't know AI. So for that right now is how do you make the gap, or is the plan to eventually capture enough data to then label it and organize it and then get an AI to do it for you? But how do you balance out? Because you're right, the human interaction element is the key piece that makes the magic because of the engagement. Telling stories in games suck. They do. Every kid, I was just talking to Dave Perry about this, and Disney demanded that they had Aladdin on the Aladdin story in the game for Aladdin. And he goes, okay, and they're doing play tests. They're watching all these kids, and everyone's just like, skip, just tapping the skip button, right? And there's only one girl watched it. And at the very end, they're like, why'd you watch it? She's like, I thought there was gonna be something important. I'm so disappointed. There was nothing important to tell me. So 2 questions, feel free to tackle them however you want, is one, how do you create that human element and facilitate and scale the human element as one piece? And the other piece that's just as challenging is how do you integrate a story into a video game and when nobody wants to hear your story? So how do you balance? Those are 2 different questions. Feel free to tackle either one.
Well, let me start with the second one, and you may need to prompt me again on that first one. But the anecdote you just told me, perfectly understandable to me. There is, on the surface, a video game these days and a movie look very similar. The visual quality can be identical, really, for the best games out there. And the kind of stories that people like to hear are very similar in the game and in the movies. but that's a very deceptive similarity, because under under the hood, they're literally 180 degrees apart. Again, getting to evolution, we like stories because when somebody tells us about what's going on, if it's a story about life and death, if it's a story about life and death that might affect you, you are riveted and really interested in what's going on. And you want to find out, what did that person do? Well, how did they experience it? How can I avoid that kind of problem? Or what did they do to succeed and win and triumph in the end? I mean, that's the plot of so many books and movies these days, forever.
Yeah.
But when you're playing a game, it's that same kind of thing. How can I survive? What can I do? Games also, the most popular games are about sort of life and death things, or about relationships. It's very Darwinian. It's either how do I survive or how do I reproduce, and how am I going to work out a relationship with somebody else, or do both of them at once, of course, since so many stories involve both of those aspects. But there it is about, what do I do and how do I do that? So when you stop the action and say, watch Aladdin and hear about his story, it's like wrenching control away from the player, saying, no, I want to be Aladdin, or I want to experience his world. I don't want to hear you tell me about Aladdin. If I wanted that, I would have watched the Aladdin movie. And conversely, if you have a movie, you don't want in the middle of the movie to have, Luke Skywalker turn to you and say, so what do you think? Should I fight him with my lightsaber, or should I run away? We've tried that. People have done that over and over again. Always fails miserably, because you want to hear what his choice was. And when he asks you, it invalidates the quality of the story, because it's no longer, here's what I did to survive. It's like, oh, Dylan, what would you do? And suddenly it's like, no, this isn't a real story. You're just making this up, and it's up to me. So anyway, that's at the core of why we need to do that. And as a consequence, in order to be a good storyteller in interactivity, you need to design a world and affordances, things that the player can do that allow them to really get immersed in the world and make decisions. And of course, what games do that almost all movies and books don't do or can't do is allow you to try something, fail, try a different thing and succeed. And that gets right to that heart of the evolutionary thing of, I am learning how to get better at this. In fact, that's true not just of video games, but of sports and board games. They're all around learning survival skills if you dissect them to the deepest level.
So it's almost like the way that you can tell a story to somebody, well, there's a couple of ways, just reflecting back here, is one is if you say, what I'm about to tell you involves your future decisions on life or death. So pay attention, because this is critical, because you're going to need to apply this shortly. So you added meaning to the story so they pay attention and they get that. That's one piece. And that is the, if you're going to do it that way. The better way to do it is to design an experience that allows someone to take actions. And then by taking actions, they are crafting the story in their own head. And so they're going through that. And then they're like, okay, so the game I'm playing here is X. Right. And then you go along that path, which is easier said than done, because it's so much easier just to tell someone what to do than to really, really hope, especially like in VR and other places. You don't have a lot of frame control. Someone might just twirl around for 10 minutes because they want to. Like, you have no way to like, okay, I'm going to force them to look at this or look at that. Have you, in terms of showing things, have you seen a way to create any type of frame control in VR, or ways to be able to direct the player to have them kind of give them that, what do you call, the magician's choice,
Yeah. Well, first I'll say, in that 400 project I mentioned before, we boiled down what you just described, that anybody who's taken any writing course will learn the dictum to show don't tell, or show don't tell. Yeah. That if you, in your story, you say, Harry was scared, he was really, really nervous, that's telling. If you say Harry sat there shivering occasionally, his teeth were chattering so loud despite the warmth of the room that he was afraid people would hear him, and his nails were bitten to the quick, that's showing that he's really nervous. In games, it's do, don't show. You want to become Harry and experience what's making him nervous, because there's this boss monster coming and you may not be able to defeat him, rather than being told this is an angry boss monster and you should be scared. You're scared because of your experiences. So that's really the do don't show is at the heart of what, telling a good story in interactivity is. Your framing thing, there's a million different ways to do it, and just like filmmakers have learned all these ways, we do many things with games. Back in the 90s, one of the techniques that we came up with, it's still used to a degree today, but not as much, was that if it was letterboxed and the screen had black bars at the top and bottom, it was cinematic, and you stop and you can watch. And then when the bars go away and it's full screen, that's the signal, okay, pick up the controller, start playing again, because it's going to be interactive. And so games that alternated between those did that. These days, it's much more likely, partly because the technology can support it, that those two things are seamless. The story changes and evolves and is told even as you're playing through the world, which takes a huge amount of computer horsepower and very expensive development to make it possible. But we can do that now, and it's actually fun to have it seamless that way.
Yeah, it's a masterpiece. That's why when you're talking about like some of the brute force methods is like, well, let's put in an improv actor, and then he'll just bring you, he'll guide you through it the best way possible, So it makes, I mean, it's what they do in actual escape rooms. They have a person watching in the background with a clipboard, so it makes a ton of sense, and it's a great way to get it done. It's just everybody wants AI, scaling these things.
Improv actors, it doesn't scale as well. You need to hire the improv actors. It turns out that this last year, with so many of their venues closed, they're really happy to find a way to do it online. But I would say, and part of one of your earlier questions was, we're talking about AI.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that a human can do as an improv actor, we are decades from being able to do with AI, or at least being able to do well enough that it's convincing. It's very much like the uncanny valley effect, that we've had computer graphics in movies for over 30, I guess the earliest ones are almost 40 years ago now. And it wasn't really until the last few years they could do convincing humans and not have it seem creepy. And even now, a lot of movies don't get it quite right. But, you think back to things like Tom Hanks in The Polar Express, really tough movie because people just didn't look real enough. We're at that kind of stage now where we were 30 years ago in terms of interaction with computers. If it's really constrained, Pixar did really well by showing you toys or insects or things that weren't human, so you could actually enjoy that. And then they gradually got good enough that they could do more human characters. But even now, they don't try to make photorealistic humans. They just use their cartoon imagery. We do that with AI, and we constrain things. You're talking to a robot, not another human being. And AI can do a better job at convincing you it's a robot than it's a human. With these improv actors and the Adventure Lab thing, one of the things that came up is one of the players meeting this Dr. Crumb character. It was a woman. She said, "Oh, Dr. Crumb, you don't recognize me? I'm your grandmother." And as an improv actor, he's trained to do yes and. So rather than say, "Are you crazy, lady?" it was like, "Oh, grandma, how are you?" And for the rest of the adventure, they kept riffing off of, "Oh, I remember when you were a little boy and you did this sort of thing." And the other people were just having a wonderful time because here's their friend who's pretending to be a grandma, and the character's coming alive. And there's no way you can program an AI today to understand what it would mean to be somebody's grandmother and what kind of experiences you should talk about.
Yeah.
So I think we're a long way from that flexibility. And I think we'll have humans in the loop, but in increasingly scalable and less sort of blatant ways, filling them in. I mean, one of the things that you can do with the Dr. Crumb adventures, they have one person who plays 3 or 4 different characters, and they use a voice distorter and the skill of this person of putting on different accents that I myself and most of the other people playing it don't realize there aren't 4 other people in the room. It's just the same person, and that's why you never see them at the same time.
See, and that's cool. And what you nailed on is it's the spread of the human. We are a general purpose machine. We do general purpose things, which means we also play these weird games where we pretend that we're each other's grandmothers. And you're like, I get the game, and then you pick up and you start riffing, and that inside secret is what makes that fun. That is a very generalized human condition thing. It's like AI has narrow intelligence, right? and we want this general purpose intelligence that just doesn't do it. It just doesn't do it. But like anybody riffing with a "I'll be your grandma," because then you could play. There's so many fun things that you could do with that. So I could totally see. It's just you can tell when people want that, but they don't understand the distance to that. It's the, you know, why can't we have flying cars that run on solar?
Yes.
You're like, well, science, you know, and so that's the gap that's what we face. This is fantastic. So let me ask you, what's your? I mean, you've been in the space for a while. You're in neuroscience. You're in gaming. You're in AR. You're in VR. You're in probably many other things. What's your holy grail? Like, what drives you to do all this? What's your what do you have an in thing that you're doing this for? Is there a place you want to get to, or?
You know, it's funny you say Holy Grail, because I was the co-designer on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade game years ago, where he's looking for the Holy Grail. So I've got some, intimate experience with searching for that. I have to say, for me, it has been just what I mentioned before, that as soon as I got my first job in the industry, literally within days of graduating college, I had this sense of, wow, this is so much fun, and they're actually paying me to do it, and it's really interesting, and there's new stuff all the time. I wonder how long this will last. And I haven't had to change that philosophy very much. I've had to learn a lot, and I've loved that process. But I mean, the people I really respect who have stayed active and vital throughout their careers have that in common, that they're constantly acquiring new things, and it's not the ones who kind of specialize in one thing and get stuck on it. I mean, I think there are a few crafts and artistry things that can be that way, but technology doesn't work that way. And what I love is that as a game designer, I've been able to just follow what I really loved. And it's a cliche, but most people have to choose between doing what they love and doing something that they can earn a living at. And I just feel very, gifted and lucky that I've been able to do both of those with two birds in one hand.
That's beautiful. I mean, it really is. I mean, being able to work and play in an area that lights you up. I know, for us, like we have clients and people that we get in, we play test with them, and it's a fun vernacular to have the verb of to play and get in and do that stuff. So I completely agree with you on that front. What, there's young people out there who are super excited about this technology, are super excited about VR, they're super excited about game design. But there's a whole world of stuff out there. I mean, what advice would you give to aspiring young game designers out there that are looking to get ahead, looking to level up their skill sets? Because there's so many things you could do. You could there's plenty of places to waste time. If they had habits or skills or rituals or patterns, what advice would you give to aspiring game designers that want to level up quickly?
Two simple things. One is do small things and complete them. Much better to have done 5 really small games. And if you're interested in being a game designer but you can't code yourself, there are programs out there now that let you actually build games. And Roblox, of course, has become hugely popular and profitable, allowing people to make their own games without a lot of technical skill. But do small things. I mean, there's a tendency, you want to do something really big. You love Fortnite, you want to make Fortnite, or World of Warcraft or something, and don't start there. Take something really small, however small you think it is. Find something much smaller than that. Maybe it's just making a very simple Candy Crush style match 3 game, but you have some twist you want to put on it, and do that, and have lots of little things to experience because you want to iterate. The other thing, and this goes beyond game designers in particular, is just to be persistent. When I look at who has succeeded in the industry, the games industry, but also in life in general, it tends to be the people that keep going. For example, I know somebody who sent out their resume to 5 companies, got rejections within a week, and just gave up on that being a career choice. And they were really good, but companies aren't always hiring all the time. And there are hundreds, there are thousands of companies that are possibilities. I've seen other people that weren't very good, didn't have a lot of talent, but they put out 1,000 resumes and number 973 hit, and they're happy as a clam and doing fine. And another case in point from the games industry, I hear arguments about whether it was number 51 or 53, but Angry Birds was, that company, Rovio, had made over 50 games, and they were in the process of filing for bankruptcy when Angry Birds, is their 53rd game, suddenly took off. So if they had not been persistent, if they'd made 3 games and said, we haven't had a huge hit, let's give up, they never would have hit Angry Birds. So lots of iteration and finishing things and being persistent. And if you can combine those two things, then almost guaranteed, whether you're skilled or not, you'll succeed. And if you're really skilled at something, you're going to do very, very well.
That's awesome. And it tells people like, yeah, okay, you want to get started? Great. What's your big vision? Now cut that in half. Now cut that in half. Now cut that in half. Now cut in half. Now you got a week. Go do it. It's like,
exactly.
just cut, cause constraints are the way that experts get started. And the conversation goes full circle. With that being said, is there any last things you'd like to let people know about before you can tell people how they find more about what you're doing, or if they can get a hold of you?
Well, I think I've covered it pretty well, but I mentioned a monkey anecdote. Let me throw that in as a bonus. So one of the things I discovered in learning about neuroscience is that there was an experience that this scientist designed way back in the late 1940s, a guy named Harry Harlow. And he's known for experimenting with rhesus monkeys and this kind of creepy thing he did with making monkeys out of cloth, mother monkeys out of cloth or out of wire, and seeing whether these baby monkeys would prefer the artificial cloth mother or the wire mother, even if only the wire mother had a bottle to nurse from. So anyway, that was what he did later. Before he got to that, he did a study on motivation in monkeys. And he constructed this puzzle, basically, a bunch of different little interlocking clips and things that had to be assembled in a certain way. And his plan was to put this in with 2 groups of monkeys, and one of them wouldn't receive any incentives. The other group would get grapes or some kind of food every time they started working with this thing and trying to complete it. And his hypothesis, and this was in the 1940s when everybody was into how can we increase workers and should we pay them more or how can we get this going? His hypothesis was that, of course, the monkeys that you're paying to do this will do a better job. And in fact, well, what is that he put these gadget setups into both cages and gave them a couple of weeks to get used to it because he didn't want them to be scared by it. And in both cages, the monkeys started, there's no better word than this, playing with this thing on their own without any motivation from food. And they both got fairly good at kind of manipulating this sort of thing. But then he started the actual test, and he was excited because the ones he paid to complete it got quickly much better at it. But then he stopped paying them. He finished his test, started writing it up, and all the monkeys in that group gave up on it completely. If you're going to pay me, great. If you're not, stop paying me. I have no more interest. In the other cage, the monkeys kept playing with it over and over again, and they got much better than the monkeys who were paid. It just took them a longer time. And it really goes to something called intrinsic motivation. But it's at the heart of why we love to play games. If you're given a chance to play and discover these things yourself, it's just really fun, and we're hardwired to enjoy that sort of thing. If you're forced into it or if you're bribed to do it, it quickly loses its luster. And I think that speaks to a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today in many different directions.
Oh, that's beautiful. That makes a ton of sense. If you're intrinsically motivated and you're doing it because, and then you're on the journey, you're going to, even just picking it up a little in here, but you're consistently doing it, you're going to improve, versus you could get a huge dopamine spike to say, here's money, here's rewards, here's success, here's fame, here's significance, and then you pull that away, and then there's no more motivation, there's no more intrinsic desire. And then it even feels less because it now devalues the act, because you basically overinflated the market. The bubble popped on the desire. Wow. That's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And that makes a lot of sense. And so when you're designing things, don't misincentivize people, because you might create the actual opposite, what we know as the Streisand effect, online, and actually cause them to go in the other direction. Wow.
Yeah, there are plenty of cases where that's been done, and it's a good lesson to learn from.
That's beautiful. Noah, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Is there any last things you'd like to say or plug or do before we wrap up this podcast?
No, thanks. I'm happy that I work as a freelancer for many years, except for my stint at Google, and I'm happily very busy right now. So I'm not looking for anything new to plug it. I just guess I'll put in a plug for people to try VR if you haven't already. The new headsets are constantly getting cheaper and better quality, and I think there's something really exciting there that I love. So, if you've been dubious about it, make the plunge, and it won't separate you from other people. It'll give you a new way to unite with them.
That's beautiful, and I completely agree 100%. So, Noah, you've been a gem. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate all that you do, and I look forward to seeing you in the virtual landscapes.
Thank you, and these have been great questions. I look forward to that as well.
That's beautiful. Take care now. I'll see you later. Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Heroes of Reality podcast. Check out heroesofreality.com for more episodes. While you're there, you can also take the Heroes quiz to find out what kind of hero you are. Or, if you have a great story and want to be on the podcast, tell us why your hero's journey will inspire others.